Hello, ErgoFoxy here. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that has come up so many times online. Actually, when I first planned out this video, I was planning on doing only one video. However, due to the need to provide time to each, I've decided to break the video down into two parts. The idea for the video came from the experience I've had in so many discussions with people online that don't know the answer to these very basic questions. Well, at least the first two. This includes conservatives, leftists, to all ends of the political spectrum. So I wanted to make a video to provide a simplified overview of these things that viewers could watch and learn a few things, maybe that they didn't know or hadn't considered. How did capitalism first start? How did socialist theory emerge? And why does it matter? Now, I want to say that we will not be talking about the first examples of capitalism or socialism in history. If someone has any more obscure examples, we will not be talking about early pseudo-communism or socialist type arrangements that have been argued by some to constitute early socialism. We will be talking about capitalism and socialism as they pertain to the global shift towards these things, and it will be in the context of Europe acting as a center of feudalism. So with that cleared up, we'll get started. While there have been more in-depth studies, I think that it serves this video to turn to the person that has been described as the father of capitalism, Adam Smith, or rather, the father of capitalist theory. Adam Smith was writing at the end of the 18th century, but as he finished his crowning achievement, The Wealth of Nations, the developed world was already in a large-scale transition towards capitalism and its partner, liberal democracy. The US had just declared its independence, France would soon see its revolution against Louis XVI, England continued to liberalize, and it was largely a world of capitalists and merchants, putting the final nail in the coffin of monarchies and rendering the nobility irrelevant in all but name. In writing his theory, Adam Smith broke down in simple language the transition that had taken place, and I think that it will be useful, seeing that other economic theorists, including socialists, looked on his writings with great respect, as they represented an achievement in the newly formed field of economic theory. And this is actually correct. Before Adam Smith, European and American colleges did not teach economic theory, so it started with him. So what can Adam Smith tell us about the birth of capitalism? And remember, we're not talking about industrial capitalism. We're talking about the early stirrings of capitalism from the feudal economic state. Smith talks about what he views as the illogical and largely irrelevant existence of the landed nobility. Even in England, the country perhaps of Europe where the yeomanry has always been most respected, it was not until about the 14th of Henry VII that the action of ejectment was invented, by which the tenant recovers not damages only, but possession, and in which his claim is not necessarily concluded by the uncertain decisions of a single assize. This action has been found so effectual a remedy that in the modern practice, when the landlord has occasion to sue for the possession of the land, he seldom makes use of the actions which properly belong to him as a landlord, the writ of right or the writ of entry, but sues in the name of his tenant by the writ of ejectment. In England, therefore, the security of the tenant is equal to that of the proprietor. In England, besides, a lease for life of 40 shillings a year value is a freehold, and that entitles the lessee to a vote for a member of the Parliament. And as a great part of the yeomanry have freeholds of that kind, the whole order becomes respectable to their landlords, on account of the political consideration which gives them. There is, I believe, nowhere in Europe except in England any instance of the tenant building upon the land which had no lease, and trusting that the honor of his landlord would take no advantage of so important an improvement. Those laws and customs, so favorable to the yeomanry, have perhaps contributed more to the present grandeur of England than all the boasted regulations of commerce taken together. Those whom the law could not protect, and were not strong enough to defend themselves, were obliged either to have recourse to the protections of some great lord, and in order to obtain it, to become either his slaves or vassals, or to enter into a league of mutual defense for the common protection of one another. The inhabitants of cities and burghs considered as a single individuals had no power to defend themselves, but by entering into a league of mutual defense with their neighbors, they were able and capable of making no contemptible resistance. The lords despised the burghers, whom they considered not only as a different order, but as a parcel of emancipated slaves, almost of a different species from themselves. The wealth of the burghers never failed to provoke the envy and indignation, and they plundered them upon every occasion without mercy or remorse. The burghers naturally hated and feared the lords. The kings hated and feared them too, but though perhaps he might despise, he had no reason either to take any hate or fear towards the burghers. Mutual interest, therefore, disposed them to support the king, and the king to support them against the lords. They were the enemies of his enemies, and it was his interest to render them as secure and independent of those enemies as he could, by granting them magistrates of their own, their privilege of making bylaws for their own government, that of building walls for their own defense, and by that of reducing all the inhabitants under a sort of military discipline. He gave them all the means of security and independency of the barons which it was in his power to bestow. So we see how this is all starting to come together as the merchants and capital investors in the cities support and join the capital-owning farmers in the country. Manufactures for distant sale grow up naturally, and as it were their own accord, by the gradual refinement of those households and coarser manufactures which must at all times be carried on even in the poorest and rudest countries. Such manufactures are generally employed upon the materials which the country produces, and they seem frequently to have been the first refined and improved of such inland countries, as it were, not indeed at a very great but at a considerable distance from the sea-coast, and sometimes even from all water carriage. An inland country, naturally, fertile and easily cultivated, produces a great surplus of provisions beyond what is necessary for maintaining the cultivators, and on account of the expense of land carriage and inconveniency of river navigation, it may frequently be difficult to send this surplus abroad. Abundance, therefore, renders provisions cheap and encourages a great number of workmen to settle the neighborhood, who find that their industry can there procure them more of the necessities and conveniences of life than in other places. They work up the materials of manufacture, which the land produces, and exchange their furnished work, or, what is the same thing, the price of it, for more materials and provisions. They give new value to the surplus part of the rude produce by saving the expense of carrying it to the waterside or some distant market, and they furnish the cultivators with something in exchange for that, which is either useful or agreeable to them, upon easier terms than they could have obtained before. So we see the coming together of farmers and merchants, and how they both allowed each other to raise their position in a primarily feudal society. The cultivators get a better price for their surplus produce and can produce cheaper and other conveniences which they have occasion for. They are thus both encouraged and enabled to increase their surplus produce by a further improvement and better cultivation of the land. And as the fertility of she land had given birth to the manufacture, so the progress of the manufacture reacts upon the land, and increases still further its fertility. The manufacturers first supply the neighborhoods, and afterwards, as their work improves and refines, more distant markets. For though neither the rude produce nor even the coarse manufacture could, without the greatest difficulty, support the expense of a considerable land carriage, the refined and improved manufacture easily may. In a small bulk of frequently contains the price of great quantity of rude produce. A piece of fine cloth, for example, which weighs only 80 pounds, contains in it the price not only of 80 pounds weight of wool, but sometimes of several thousand weight of corn, the maintenance of the different working people and their immediate employers. The corn, which could with difficulty have been carried abroad in its own shape, is in this manner virtually exported in that of the complete manufacture, and may easily be sent to remotest corners of the world. In this manner have grown up naturally and, as it were, of their own accord, the manufactures of Leeds, Halifax, Sheffield, Birmingham, and Wolverhampton. Such manufactures are the offspring of agriculture. In the modern history of Europe, their extension and improvement have generally been posterior to those which were in the offspring of foreign commerce. England was noted for the manufacture of fine cloths made of Spanish wool, more than a century before any of those which now flourish in the places above mentioned were fit for foreign sale. The extension and improvement of these last could not take place but in consequence of the extension and improvement of agriculture. So here Smith lays out the development of the growth of cities and their place in the growing capitalism of Europe. He talks about how they complemented and grew the freeholders or landowners that comprised the early capitalists, and how the city dwellers in turn became freeholders themselves, and put forth the capital projects to purchase land and develop agriculture, pushing forward the development of the land. However, Smith rounds out this discussion by talking about the change that these developments were having in unseating the system of feudalism in Europe from its perch and replacing it with the reigning economic and political system that was to be, capitalism. He writes, "First, by affording a great and ready market for the rude produce of the country, they gave encouragement to its cultivation and further improvement. This benefit was not even confined to the countries in which they were situated, but extended more or less to all of those which they had any dealings. To all of them they afforded a market for some part either of their rude or manufactured produce, and consequently gave some encouragement to the industry and improvement of all. Their own country, however, on account of its neighborhood, necessarily derived the greatest benefit from this market. Its rude produce being charged with less carriage, the traders could pay the growers a better price for it, and yet afforded as cheap to the consumers and that of more distant countries. Secondly, the wealth acquired by the inhabitants of cities was frequently employed in purchasing such lands as were to be sold, of which a great part would frequently be uncultivated. Merchants are commonly ambitious of becoming country gentlemen, and when they do, they are generally the best of all improvers. A merchant is accustomed to employ his money chiefly in profitable projects, whereas a mere country gentleman is accustomed to employ it chiefly in expense. The one often sees his money go from him and return to him again with profit. The other, who once he parts with it, very seldom expects to see any more of it. These different habits naturally affect them in every sort of business. The merchant is commonly a bold, a country gentleman a timid undertaker. The one is not afraid to lay out at once the capital upon the improvement of his land, when he has a probable prospect of raising the value in proportion of the expense. The other, if he has any capital, which is not always the case, seldom ventures to employ it in this manner. If he improves at all, it is commonly not with a capital, but what he can save out of annual revenue. Whoever has had the fortune to live in an improved country must have frequently observed how much more spirited the operations of merchants were in this way than those of mere country gentlemen. The habits, besides, of order, economy, and attention, to which mercantile business naturally forms a merchant, render him much fitter to execute, with profit and success, any project of improvement. The personal expense of the great proprietors having in this manner gradually increased, it was impossible that the number of their retainers should not as gradually diminish, till they were at last dismissed altogether. The same cause gradually led them to dismiss the unnecessary part of their tenants. Farms were enlarged, and the occupiers of land, notwithstanding the complaints of depopulation, reduced to the number necessary for cultivating it, according to the imperfect state of cultivation and improvement in those times. By the removal of the unnecessary mouths, and by exacting from the farmers the full value of the farm, a greater surplus, or what is the same thing, the price of a greater surplus, was obtained for the proprietor, which the merchants and manufacturers soon furnished him with a method of spending upon his own person, in the same manner as he had done the rest. The cause continuing to operate, he was desirous to raise his rents above what his lands, in the actual state of their improvement, could afford. His tenants could agree to this upon the condition only that they should be secured in their possession for such a term of years as might give them time to recover with profit whatever they should lay not in the future improvement of the land. The expensive vanity of the landlord made him willing to accept this, and hence the origin of long leases. And here we start to see Smith show the tensions building between the lords and the tenants. He is showing their power slip and their relevance begin to wane as they hold on to their last vestment of power. This was not missed upon the readership of the late 1700s. The tenants, having in this manner become independent, and the retainers being dismissed, the great proprietors were no longer capable of interrupting the regular execution of justice, or of disturbing the peace of the country. Having sold their birthright, not like Esau, for a mess of pottage in times of hunger and necessity, but in the wantonness of plenty, for trinkets and baubles, fitter to be the playthings of children than the serious pursuits of men, they became as insignificant as any substantial burgher or tradesman in a city. A regular government was established in the country as well as in the city, nobody having sufficient power to disturb its operation in the one any more than in the other. A revolution of the greatest importance to the public happiness was in this manner brought about by two different orders of people who had not the least intention to serve the public. To gratify the most childish vanity was the sole motive of the great proprietors. The merchants and artificers, much less ridiculous, acted merely from a view of their own interest and in pursuit of their own peddler principle of turning a penny wherever a penny was to be got. Neither of them had either knowledge or foresight of the great revolution which the folly of the one and the industry of the other was gradually bringing about. In this, Smith has laid out from start to finish a general summary of the rise of capitalism and the supplanting of feudalism. In the years that followed the book's publishing, the United States would win its independence, the French Revolution would occur, further liberalizations would take place in England, early industrial capitalism would develop in England, and the modern industrial era would start. However, there are certain things that may not be clear simply from Smith's retelling of these early capitalist developments. For Smith is referring to events going back all the way to the 1300s. That may not be clear from the text. We need to look into the background of the subjects he describes. So Smith talks about the rise of freeholders and the decline of serfs. But what precipitated this? This is commonly attributed to many developments, but principal among them, the peasant revolts of 14th century England and France. In 1358, what would become known as the Jacquerie took place, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was during the Hundred Years' War and was violently suppressed by the French nobility. It became known as the Jacquerie because the nobles disparagingly referred to the peasants as jacks, for their padded supplice or tunic called a jack. The word Jacquerie became a synonym for peasant uprisings in general in England and France. This is unrelated to Jacobin, which is a term you may have heard, but they are both terms that refer to the same garment commonly in use by the Catholic Church. The rebellion lacked any sort of clear goals or new system to replace the feudal one, but it sent a clear message to the French nobility that feudal obligations were breaking down and the loyalty of the serfs was now in question. The revolt was suppressed by French nobles and gentry led by Charles the Bad of Navarre, cousin, brother-in-law, and mortal enemy of the regent, whose throne he was attempting to usurp. Basically, they threw away all conventions of chivalry, tortured and murdered the leaders of the rebelling peasants, and killed an estimated 20,000 of them. The rebellion lacked any sort of clear goals or new system to replace the feudal one, but it sent a clear message to the French nobility that the feudal obligations were breaking down, and the loyalty of the serfs was now in question. Later, the English peasant revolt of 1381 occurred, which was an uprising across large parts of England. The revolt had many causes, from economic to political, but it largely resulted from the Black Death of the 1340s, as well as high taxes that had to be levied following the conflict with France during the Hundred Years' War. There was also a general instability within the leadership of London at the time, which resulted in a general loss of trust. The final trigger for the revolt was the intervention of the royal official John Brampton in Essex in May 1381. His attempts to collect unpaid poll taxes in Brentwood ended in violent protest, which then rapidly spread across the southeast of the country. A wide spectrum of rural society, including many local tradespeople and village officials, rose up in protest and burned court records, freed prisoners. The rebels sought a reduction in taxation, an end to serfdom, and the removal of King Richard II's senior officials and law courts. What occurred in the following years and centuries was, as Adam Smith pointed to earlier, the gradual dissipation of serfdom. Serfs either ran away from their feudal obligations to the cities, where they gained their freedoms, or they gradually saved enough wealth to purchase their lands and free themselves from their previous indentured servitude. Regardless, the 14th century was the turning point. The 15th century, which was also not covered in depth within the Wealth of Nations, saw the rise of what was to become as the 40-shilling freeholder. The year is 1429 in England. All British subjects who held a lease on land valued at 40 shillings annually were entitled to vote for representation in the British Parliament. If this sounds familiar, there grew systems such as this in many countries, including the early United States. The origins of the original House of Commons date back from the second half of the 13th century, when landlords and property owners of the counties and towns had to resort to sending representatives to Parliament to present grievances and petitions to the king, and to settle affairs of taxation. In the 14th century, the knights and burgesses who were chosen as representatives, i.e. the commons,
began sitting in a separate chamber or house from that used by the nobles and high clergy, i.e., the lords. So the division of Parliament into two houses occurred during the reign of Edward III. In 1341, the Commons met separately from the nobility and clergy for the first time, which created what was essentially an upper and lower chamber, with the knights and burgesses sitting in the latter. They formed what became known as the House of Commons, while the clergy and nobility became the House of Lords. Although they remained subordinate to both the Crown and the Lords, the Commons did act with increasing boldness. During the Good Parliament of 1376, the Commons appointed Sir Peter de la Mare to convey to the Lords their complaints of heavy taxation, as well as demands for an accounting of the royal expenditures, and they criticized the king's management of the military.
So in this way, we see a growing capitalist class, as well as the landowners growing in political influence. So this is all setting the stage for both modern industrial capitalism and modern liberal democracy. I hope that this video has given you some understanding in a simple format about the economic and social concepts described. The next video will focus on early socialist theory, so I encourage you to watch it. I learned quite a few things myself, as I had known about the author that is attributed as the first socialist theorist in the 1500s, but I had not read the text of his book in depth, and I think you'll find it very interesting, so make sure to look into that. Before this becomes too long of a video, I want to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I will be producing more of these videos, and channels such as this are actually extremely rare. So if you enjoyed this content or got something out of it, please subscribe. Thank you again, and I wish you all a wonderful day.